Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, gentili tutti e tutti, dearest gentle colleagues, I would like to introduce Axel Braun's Venice project, quoting the bright German writer and former scholarship holder of the Centro Tedesco, Leonard Stahlmann. I quote, "If one can no longer live forwards, one simply changes direction." End of quote. The Essen-based artist and photographer Axel Braun indeed is looking back in order to reflect the life that lies ahead in his project Machina Mundi, Reign of Reason, built on the backs of others. Tonight he will present videos and stills. One is already well known to all of you. Stills from work that document in slow motion artifacts from the Serenissima, the former Venice Republic. He slowly scans objects and landscapes with his camera, which results in a very calm narrative style. By taking a cinematic approach to his presentation of such objects at the opulent tomb of Doge Giovanni Pesaro in the Frari, nearby the Centro, he enables the viewer to contemplatively consider the historical context. For his video, Braun selects details of the two-story 17th century monuments that represent the living Doge at the peak of his power, surrounded by allegories. The artist juxtaposed the primo inter pares in the regalia and the four women who symbolize intelligence, nobility, wealth, and scholarship with close-ups of the columns below. He documents the figures of the slaves, variations on the Baroque Telamon motif, whose black bodies contrast with the white stone. Braun emphasizes a sequence in which tiny areas of black legs show through the torn garment, forcing the viewer to look more closely, because a fleeting glance is not enough for them to grasp their context. The artist's aims is that the keywords in the title Sklave, Doge, Frari, Venedig, Sclavi, Doge, Frari, Venice, should provide us with sufficient information to be able to rapidly look up the meaning and interpretation. On the other hand, he can assume that Venetisti are already able to place this detail. The history of African slaves in Venice will be main topic of the paper by Vera Simone Schulz. In this context, I want to point out briefly the contribution in occasion of the 15th Art Biennale in 2003 by the US-American artist Fred Wilson, who has Afro-American and Caribbean roots and was born in the Bronx in 1954, in the Bronx in 1954. As a representative of North America, Wilson flanked the main entrance to the classicist USA pavilion in the Giardini with two oversized copies of the Telamon slave figures from the Frari tomb in order to pursue the question of whether there had been a people of color community in the history of La Serenissima. Inside the pavilion, Wilson worked associatively and presented a range of objects that had formal associations with the subject, including a black Murano glass candlestick in the style of the 18th century. Despite of their formal diversity, the contents of the work of the two artists have much in common. Braun, like Wilson, uses the century-old black community in Venice as the starting point of his critique of the way in which the role of African people has been erased from European history. Axel Braun takes up the threads of the post-colonial discourse in his study of the glass pearls from Murano that were created for the African region, where they circulated and were exchanged for other goods. That his artistic investigation of glass pearls as a means of exchange and payment in colonized regions is highly topical shows the related project by Frauke Zabel, Munich-based artist and former scholarship holder here at the Centro, as well as the collection of samples of Venetian glass pearls manufactured by Constantini Valmarana in the 1930s in the spatial installation Monte di Pietà by Christoph Büchel in the Fondazione Prada during the last Arte Biennale in 2024. The wider context in which Axel Braun investigates different traces of the Anthropocene in Venice and the Venetian lagoon direct the artist towards the past. In the photo, we can see it here, the Fade Madonna del Monte from 2024, Braun draws our attention to the silhouette of a ruin, set against the soft pink light of the dusk. But while Braun's evening image looks back upon the decay in the north of the lagoon, an earlier work from the overall project, Disturbed Harmonies, Anthropocene Landscapes, turns to the future. His video, Still Nothing is Impossible in a Place Where Dreams Become Reality, construction site of New Songdo City 2 from 2012, shows mud flats in glistening daylight that is simultaneously illuminating a sea of towering buildings in the background. Still a building site over a decade ago, this is now a dense residential district in the megacity of Incheon in South Korea, just outside from Seoul. The coastal environment documented by Axel Braun does not longer exist. Thus, in the eyes of today's viewer, this image is just a retrospective as Braun studies of Venice. Tonight, we will be introduced by Axel to the diverse storylines of his project Machina Mundi, Reign of Reason. But like individual objects in a huge kaleidoscope, they will only come together in his final form of presentation, a three-dimensional mixed media essay in occasion of his solo exhibition at the Kunstverein Ruhr in Essen next summer in 2026. Then Braun will combine photos, videos, archival documents, and historical objects in a spatial installation in which visitors can independently address individual subjects more deeply in line with their particular interest. But now the floor is yours. Welcome, Axel Braun.
Good evening. My name is Axel Braun, and thank you very much to Cristina Baldacci and Petra Schäfer for this great introduction. And thanks a lot as well to dear President Barbara Kuhn and dear President Robert Fajen, as well as dear Richard, for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak here, and I look forward to the discussions both after my presentation and in the coming days during the conference. As we have many renowned experts on Venice gathered here, I look forward to your comments and suggestions, and I actually hope for new research directions. My lecture performance will be a journey with a lot of visual input. As an artist, I rely on a research-based approach. I consult literature from a broad range of scientific disciplines and continue my investigations in museums and archives, or in situ in architecture and landscapes. My aim is not only to complement knowledge with visuals, but also to inform my visual productions through knowledge. By contextualizing and presenting these visuals, I offer an opportunity to challenge perspectives and raise questions. My artistic practice is structured around long-term projects, which in turn are structured into case studies. For more than 10 years, I have been collecting case studies for my previous long-term project, Disturbed Harmonies, which understands landscapes as unintended monuments to political, economic, social, cultural, and ecological processes that characterize our transition into the Anthropocene, the geological epoch defined by human action. In 2024, I decided to start a new or additional long-term project that actually focuses on historical worldviews and their influence on contemporary problems and global phenomena. It is an attempt to understand the developments of mindsets that paved humanity's way towards the Anthropocene. Built on the backs of others is the first case study for this long-term project. Before I delve into my findings from Venice, I will briefly explain the title Machina Mundi, Reign of Reason. First, for this, I would like to show you a clockwork from the 15th century, which is exhibited in the Frari Church, actually just a few meters from here. Clockworks work particularly well to illustrate the concept of Machina Mundi, especially as the contemporaries have also used this metaphor. Machina Mundi is a worldview that emerged during the late medieval period. It envisions the universe as a mechanism where all processes and events unfold according to a calculated plan. Throughout the Renaissance, humans gained knowledge and confidence, striving to understand these processes in order to influence and master them. Later, the Enlightenment intensified a conceptual dualism between humanity and nature. Humans, as rational subjects, were to understand nature as an object of knowledge and control. Johann Gottlieb Fichte observed a continuing strife between reason and nature, in which human rationale will eventually dominate. Often, harshly contrasting processes are deeply entangled. Beauty is preconditioned by brutality, and scientific splendor coincides with atrocities. Despite being one of the most admired examples of human creation, Venice is no exception. During my residence at Centro Tedesco, I had the chance to collect examples from the built environment and material culture of Venice, its lagoon, and the former empire. My aim was to find out how the historical worldviews that I've just referred to have resonated or might have resonated in objects and landscapes. My case study approaches the city as a fragile relic of a glorious past. It is a sample that enables us to observe the fundamental structures and vulnerable points of global networks. Nature at large will adapt to any form of anthropogenic devastation. But eventually, humans will suffer the most from the processes that their species has triggered. humanity has repeatedly produced unprecedented creativity with impressive and often beautiful results, just like Venice. Unfortunately, the unintended consequences can be incalculable, and many achievements benefit just a chosen few, especially when they have been built on the backs of others. Often, environmental history is hard to separate from the histories of wars, slavery, colonialism, or economic systems. We need the other to define ourselves. Societies distinguish between their members and those who are excluded. However, successful isolation from foreign influences has been an exception in human history. Empires, in contrast, follow an inherent logic of expansion. This makes definitions of belonging even more vital for those who aim to assert and sustain power. To oppress, exploit, and extract, it is necessary to know your kin and to exclude the rest from the rights that you claim for yourself. At the same time, offering purpose and justification for the profiteers is crucial, because nobody wants to be the bad guy. Thus, it is common practice to define moral standards accordingly. A series of reliefs on the facade of the Scuola Grande di San Marco illustrates the virtues of this powerful brotherhood. Here we see four putti torturing a satyr. The latter was a symbol for impulsiveness, weak morals, and the barbarian other since classical times. However, to a contemporary eye, the chosen means to assert the good might be irritating. As sometimes that which is believed to be good is evil. Much has been written about the virtues and achievements of La Serenissima Repubblica. Venetian art and architecture, but also its political and economic inventions, have been idealized and imitated worldwide. Nevertheless, the myths of Venice are omnipresent in the city's artworks. They mixed fact and fiction, aiming to consolidate power through what later might have been called cultural hegemony. Venice has never disguised its use of theft and looting to accumulate wealth. Instead, it proudly presented the bounty as a means of claiming ascendancy. At the same time, maintaining diplomatic relations with friends and enemies was a precondition for a successful mercantile network. From the early Middle Ages, the capturing, buying, shipping, and selling of slaves was a substantial pillar of the emerging trade empire. While enslaving fellow Christians was already prohibited, pagan Slavs from the Balkans were among the first to be traded across the Mediterranean. At the time, there was a strong demand in Middle Eastern and North African societies for subjugated workers and warriors. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, slavery became less accepted in Europe, but the devastating effects of the plague resulted in a return to earlier standards. From the Renaissance onwards, artworks depicting African slaves and servants confirmed their owner's status, as in this tomb to Doge Giovanni Pesaro. Nevertheless, there are indices for a latent bad conscience among Venetian slaveholders. Numerous wills illustrate that many slaves were freed after their master's death, which ensured the masters the convenience of slavery during their lifetime and an unhindered transition to heaven after they passed away. Murano's glass workshops created a monopoly for Venice that endured for centuries. When the trade in luxury goods declined in the early modern age, the industry was saved by a rising demand for glass beads. Beads were a traditional currency for many indigenous communities in Africa, Asia, and the New World. Thus, Europe's emerging colonial powers and their slave traders recognized the advantages of Murano's knowledge and production capacities. While Venice had lost its prominent position in world trade, it could still benefit from the networks that have been created by its successors. The most notable of these was the triangular trade that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas with logistical efficiency. Beads from Venice were shipped to West Africa, where they were exchanged against slaves who were to be sold in the Americas. From there, the ships brought colonial goods back to Europe, where the process was started anew. For more than 2 centuries, Venice was the leading supplier of these glass beads. As a result of the inflationary use of this currency, changing designs and more sophisticated production techniques became necessary. To prevent a saturation of the markets and to react to changing preferences among the trading partners. In a time in which Christian values and the innovations of the Enlightenment were improving the rights of male Europeans, there was no hesitation in dehumanizing entire populations in other parts of the world. Occasionally, archaeologists discover Venetian beads in unmarked tombs scattered around the globe. A city built on water provided security from its enemies, but it imposed countless other challenges on the growing metropolis. Thus, Venice has always depended on the terra firma and the exchange with the outside world. Analogous to its expansion of power, controlling trade routes, battling enemies, and establishing colonies became vital requirements. The city's built environment and material culture mirror these processes. Construction materials, know-how, and a workforce needed to be imported, sometimes through trade and persuasion, and sometimes through theft and coercion. Pietra d'Istria is just one example of this dependency. Without these exceptionally durable stones that have literally risen from the sea, the city would have vanished long ago. Kirmeniak, or what has been falsely labeled as Istrian marble, has been used for foundations, bridges, and pavements, as well as for countless sculptures and ornaments. The stonemason's capital at the Doge's palace can be seen as a monument to the artists and artisans, as well as their resources. Almost every cultural practice that was mastered in the lagoon would have been unthinkable without imported ingredients, from wood and stone to metals and minerals. Thus, exploring and extracting were added to the list of the vital skills cultivated in Venice. The incredulous apprentice once more illustrates the separation of the true Venetians from the others. However, it also demonstrates the role of the foreign workforce in the emergence of this cultural center. The apprentice here is working on a column of red porphyry. Next to Pietra d'Istria, it is one of the most characteristic stones used in the representative architecture of Venice. Significant amounts of this material were looted from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. They have been presented as spolia or recycled as inlays in floors and facades. For centuries, humanity has understood itself as superior within the alleged duality of nature and culture. This has permitted the relentless exploitation of all available resources. Just slowly we are starting to understand the level of exposure of our species to the natural forces that we increasingly influence, but cannot control. Some of the oldest traces of human existence in the lagoon have been discovered on the islands of Torcello. Around the year 1000, it was more densely populated than Rivo Alto was at the time. However, it declined in analogy to the rise of Venice around Rialto and San Marco. Until the end of the medieval ages, the population had shrunk drastically, buildings were demolished, and the construction materials were reused elsewhere. Currently, rising sea levels due to climate change threaten the Venetian islands. Back then, the lagoon was becoming marshy due to sediments and the freshwater influx of the mountain rivers. The resulting problems for navigation and the spread of malaria sealed Torcello's fate. The Barene are a last refuge for fish and birds in the lagoon. They have developed on the very sediments that became a challenge in the Middle Ages. The constant interplay of erosion, flooding, and silting is typical in a natural lagoon. However, in a built environment that countless humans use and navigate each day, there is no room left for transformations. The remaining sandbanks must be artificially reinforced to protect them from the waves of the vaporetti, while the waterways must be regularly dredged to maintain their navigability. Since the Middle Ages, the Venetian authorities have established expert commissions to find solutions for the persistent silting of the lagoon. Soon, the Brenta River, which originates in the High Alps, was identified as the root of all evil. Before long, the Piave and other rivers with estuaries in the lagoon were targeted as well. For over 3 centuries, efforts have been made to manage the situation. What began as a trial and error approach evolved into profound expertise in hydrological engineering. Rivers were canalized or entirely diverted. Islands were reinforced and connected through land reclamation. The canals within the lagoon were dredged and, in other places, obstructed. Until the end of the 17th century, the larger rivers were banned from the lagoon. On the left side of the map, the Brenta River is easy to recognize. Its estuary was relocated approximately 30 kilometers to the south, close to Chioggia. The resulting Brenta Nova is a straight canal. On its last kilometers, only a dike prevents it from flowing into the lagoon. The former Brenta Delta, instead, receives only a small portion of the river's discharge. At first glance, this landscape appears like a romantic natural landscape. However, it is shaped by roads and hydrological devices and plays a significant role in the lagoon's purification system. The existence of this landscape depends on human oversight and intervention. The empire has been reduced to the crumbling remnants of its capital. The beauty and glorious history of Venice are its final assets. After centuries of trading the most exclusive goods, the city sells its scenery like a commodity. Will it eventually be choked by over-tourism? Or will it become an isolated resort only for those who can afford it? Whatever happens, there are other and more substantial threats. The cultural skills that once facilitated the unlikely rise of a city built on water have developed exponentially over the last centuries. The result is an ever-expanding technosphere. Venice is an entirely built environment. It is increasingly facing the devastating consequences of human interference in the Earth system. The lagoon has become a scale model for the global challenges of the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.